Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Motoyuki.
I'm Dr. Paul Kalnins.
Welcome to Enliven Medicine, the channel where we explore holism, the nature of consciousness, and the future of medicine. Today we'll be continuing the discussion from last week, exploring etheric forces in matter, specifically in the realm of biochemistry. If you find this video helpful, please give us a thumbs up and share with your friends. If you want to join our journey, hit subscribe as well as the notifications bell. And finally, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to post them below and we'll do our best to get back to you. Before we begin our talk today, another question from our viewer, Jess Brown in Portland, Oregon, who wants to know more about quantum entanglement. And I would add, just to keep things concise, its relevance to medicine.
Yeah, so that's actually something we need to talk a lot about when we talk about etheric or the so-called etheric forces. So I don't know how much I want to jump in right this moment on that question, but it's something I want to unfold maybe over the course of the discussion today. I will just start by saying we have to be careful. Like my background before this was in physics and some quantum theory, and let's just say for professional physicists and whatnot, there's a lot of animosity towards the integrative medicine community using the word quantum because, in physics, we use quantum mechanics to calculate things. And that's really what it means is not really considered to be part of physics. It's more like, can we use it to calculate the position of an atom, things like that. And so the philosophical speculation that comes in with it tends to, I think, turn away a lot of professional scientists when we start to use those words quantum. So you have to be careful about that. What quantum is talking about is phenomena at the subatomic level. And the kind of, insight from quantum mechanics is a lot of those phenomena start to disappear when we get into a regular world of matter, dealing with large objects, even at the level of living organisms. A lot of those quantum effects disappear because you reach a certain threshold. That said, with quantum mechanics, we're finding that quantum effects, and we have to kind of lay out what those mean. Quantum effects can now be observed in larger molecular groups, like, for example, chlorophyll. And so it's not just isolated to electrons and subatomic particles. We now are seeing quantum effects at larger molecular levels in living organisms. And so there is an emerging field in a conventional sense called quantum biology that's looking at those connections. But applying those ideas to organ systems, to how human beings interact and whatnot, I think that's where it then gets more into the speculative field, taking quantum mechanics into a different direction. So I'll come back to specifically what quantum entanglement means and how we can kind of view that. So I promise to try to answer that question today. Great. So I think, last episode went into this discussion about, when we look at the physical world and physical matter, and especially in the world of the minerals and non-living things, we have a certain ordering, we have a certain type of forces, we have our forces of electromagnetism, gravity, and the strong and weak nuclear forces. And those are the forces that physics uses to describe the entire world. And of course, that extends into chemistry, which is basically, we can say, a modified electromagnetism. So we're talking about positive and negative charges and how molecules come together or repel each other. And then we extend that to biology and so forth. One of the things that's always important to realize in whatever conceptual system we're using or paradigm we're using is we use what are called conceptual metaphors for understanding. And in science, and this applies to really our whole scientific worldview today, we use several very simple conceptual metaphors that I think a lot of people don't realize as much. So one of the big conceptual metaphors in physics and science in general is, I call it the billiard ball model of thinking. You got one thing, you got another thing, and for them to interact, you got to hit it. And so it's like everything is just interacting particles. And that's biochemistry. You know, when you study chemistry, it's like one atom interacts with another, or one molecule interacts with another. And we use that same analogy at the very small level. So the analogy we use is kids pushing each other around, we're translating down into the biochemical. Another important conceptual metaphor we use often is if you have something on top of a hill, let's say a ball, and you let it roll down in gravity into a valley, that same metaphor is abstracted into the conceptual space, and we use that to describe energy. Kinetic versus potential energy is based on that same diagram. So a lot of our thinking, let's say in medicine, is very much determined by these conceptual metaphors. And the biggest one, I think, is that billiard ball one, where everyone's, if I ingest the medicine, the only way it can work is for it to actually come in and hit something else, a receptor or something physically. And, you know, going a little further, we'd say conceptual metaphors in medicine, we can say the primary conceptual metaphors are based on warfare. You know, so we have an enemy, the germ, and we have to kill it. so we apply those same conceptual metaphors to everything we do. And even in integrative medicine, so-called integrated and holistic medicine, I think we carry those same conceptual metaphors into it, but we're not aware of that so much. You know, our experience today is so much grounded in physical space. So, you know, when you go out in the world, you see physical things out there, and they're related to each other through physical space. And then we start talking about energy, medicine, and things. People take that same conceptual metaphor and apply it to those inner spaces. And that's actually, I would argue, not correct. That's a big problem. The energies people talk about in holistic medicine and whatnot have nothing to do or are very different than the energies we talk about in physical space: gravity, electromagnetism, and the nuclear forces. In the 19th century, biologists felt that there must be a fifth force. They didn't know about the nuclear forces, and they began to just slowly learn about electromagnetism in the 19th century. But they didn't know, they thought there must be a fifth life force out there. That was the vitalistic idea. And they never found it because, as I argued last time, the life forces don't actually come from physical space. We can't use three-dimensional thinking, three-dimensional geometry, which is based on what we might call Euclidean geometry. We can't use that to understand the life forces. Life forces really are coming in through time. They are not an extra force, like an extra special electromagnetic force or something like that, but they use the gravity and electromagnetic forces to influence outcomes. And that's where the quantum effects come in. So when you have a quantum system, so let's say you have a particle like an electron, we can describe it using something called the quantum wave function. And the quantum wave function, there's a lot of details that go into what that is, but very simplistically, it says it is a measurement of probability of where, for example, if you try to measure a particle's location, where it should be in space. And so it tells us, okay, you know, you have this electron, according to the quantum wave function, it's actually distributed throughout all of space. And when you measure it, then it collapses into where we think an electron is. So that's the whole wave versus particle duality. You know, is something a wave or is it a particle? And it's not a wave of physical matter or something, it's actually a wave of probability. So when we start talking about the quantum wave function, we get into this weirdness, like what is the quantum wave function? And the way physicists have normally dealt with that is to say it's an abstraction. We just use it to calculate. You don't have to worry about what it means. It just helps us calculate where things are. But interestingly, some experiments were done, and the latest, I think, was back in 2014 or something, that actually suggested, and there was a paper written about this too, that suggested for quantum mechanics to be consistent, the quantum wave function has to be a real thing. In other words, it's a real entity. And what's interesting about the quantum wave function is that half of it uses what are called complex numbers. I, if anyone studied mathematics, I is the square root of -1. What is a square root of -1? Square root of anything should be a positive number, right? And you multiply two numbers together, you get their square, it should cancel out any negative signs. Taking the square root of -1, it doesn't make sense. So it doesn't exist in physical space. And, you know, mathematicians say, well, we use it for calculation, but what if it actually existed in a space? What if there was a parallel space where this quantum wave function was a reality? And that when we talk about these life forces, what we're really talking about is collapsing the quantum wave function towards a certain outcome. It biases, let's say, chemical reactions to work in a certain way. So I talked about last time this traditional notion of the etheric forces as being something that goes against entropy, that they restore order, that they move living organisms away from falling apart, from chaos. And they're at the basis of our inner life activities of anabolism, regeneration, reproduction, and so forth. That's how historically the life forces have been talked about. In a way, to have a life activity, you have to bias it away from entropy. When you have a corpse on the table, the life is dead, it falls back into entropy. All the biochemical reactions are stopped, and we just have chemistry take over, and they fall into, you know, decay. Something in living organisms is biasing those reactions towards a certain outcome. For example, towards the formation of an organ or formation of a structure or something. It's like something reaches back from time and guides the processes towards that outcome. There's something called complexity theory that talks about what are called strange attractors. It's like systems are attracted towards certain states. And you know, this is kind of where these forces work in. So we might think that the etheric forces are working through quantum effects. And, you know, at that level, then we start to see all sorts of weird phenomena, that they're no longer like the physical forces, which is why we've never measured them like we have physical forces, because they're not measurable in the usual senses. But they do influence and bias physical forces towards an outcome. And that's where the life organization comes in. You know, I think many people have tried to describe what are if we were to really take that old notion of the etheric into modern language in physics, how would we describe an etheric space? Again, a physical space we can describe using three vectors, X, Y, and Z, and we can walk around. And if you study physics and mechanics and electrodynamics, they're all based on that three-dimensional space. An etheric space would have to be something that's actually the inverse of that space. And that's how it's talked about, for example, in anthroposophy. And that was an insight from Rudolf Steiner, that an etheric space is actually a negative or polar Euclidean space. So what does that mean? It sounds very complicated. Well, let's say I have a point in Euclidean space, my normal 3D space. What is the etheric equivalent of that point? It's actually a sphere at infinity. I mean, that sounds really weird to think about, but every point in space has an associated sphere at infinity in this parallel space. And so what I do to a point here affects an entire sphere of influence at the periphery. Similarly, a sphere here is actually equivalent to a point in etheric space. So it's kind of weird. When I move matter together in physical space, the etheric space expands. And when I take matter apart, the etheric space moves in. So these are really interesting. I mean, this is something interesting that Rudolf Steiner talked about, that if you really want to enter into an understanding of these more subtle organizing forces, you have to study advanced mathematics, or at least develop the conceptual ability to hold these things in your mind and to work with them.
Yeah, I mean, it does make me wonder about practices such as Tai Chi, where you are like, as I'm expanding outwards with the backs of my hands, I'm also expanding back through my scapula as the crown of my head is gently lifting.
Yeah.
I'm also gradually dropping the tailbone so as to strengthen the spine or straighten the spine. But there's this idea that there's both yin and yang within within a single movement that's always present. And I'm wondering if that's working on some level of entrainment with those principles.
Yeah, what you're doing is you're entraining by focusing your consciousness on that different space. So again, when you in normal 3D consciousness, our everyday consciousness, our intellectual consciousness, we move into a point, and we can study points and how they fit together. But if you're thinking etherically, you have to study these peripheral forces. So you have to look outside the point. It's kind of like an art class. You know, one of your first exercises is to draw something, and then maybe a little more advanced, you draw the negative space around that thing. That gets you more into this comprehension of these etheric forces, etheric spaces, and then forces work through those spaces. So as I went into last time, you know, with each phase of matter in physical space, the solid, the liquid, the gaseous, and warmth, there's an associated etheric force that works in. So there's an etheric force that works into the solid that Rudolf Steiner called the life ether, that organizes or gives life to, raises in this quantum sense, the matter to a higher level of organization, a living state. And so matter that's permeated by these three-dimensional life ether forces is living. In the case of fluid, you know, there we have what Steiner referred to as the chemical tone ether, and these forces are more like musical in quality. They work through octaves and they organize matter chemistry, basically. It's interesting in chemistry to look at how chemical elements combine in whole number ratios, which is kind of unique when you think about it. You know, and if you look at the ratios, let's say, for example, methane, you have a carbon with 4 hydrogens. That is a musical ratio of 1 to 4, a fourth. You have other elements that combine ratio of 1 to 3, that's a 1/3. Others that are 1 to 5, a fifth. And so you have musical ratios in chemistry. And then, of course, as I discussed last time, the whole periodic table is based on the octave principle. So that's the tone ether. And the way Steiner described it is that it works only 2-dimensionally. So if you are a being, let's say a tone ether being, and again, I'm using this in an abstract sense, we can talk about beings living in these dimensions, you would only have 2 dimensions available to you. You can only move in a plane. The up-down direction would not be possible for you. And so you'd be sort of trapped to that dimension, which starts to open up some interesting ideas when people, for example, if you go to China, you have the whole, you know, feng shui. And that, you know, is a science that deals with, ostensibly, these forces, that builds architecture, structures, to either capture or deflect some of those energies. So you build certain structures to almost like make sure that if there's a 2-dimensional ether being that comes in, it gets shunted in a certain direction. So it's like people had an intuition about how to work with this historically. They build roof lines and the shape of houses to either allow or to disallow these different beings or these different forces from working in. It's like they had an intuitive grasp of that. I don't think they didn't have the geometry worked out, but they intuitively understood this. So these 2-dimensional beings come into the fluid element. In the case of the gaseous element, there's a 1-dimensional etheric force, and that is what Steiner called the light ether. So a light ether being could only move back and forth in one direction in a way. And then finally, the warmth ether is really similar to the warmth state, kinetic energy, and it evolves, though, through time. So all of these have a time element, but they work through different dimensions in time. So it's kind of mind-boggling to think about, but again, this is where it's not just that there's some special life force like electricity out there. It's a whole different space interacting with matter that gives matter different properties. It biases matter again towards negative entropy, towards, you know, a state of not falling apart into chaos and so forth. And it also has some interesting effects. So in the case of matter, 2 points interacting, I said we have a conceptual metaphor. It's usually one thing banging into another, you know, moving. In the case of the ether world, basically these 2 points would be connected through spheres and they work through mutual resonance. So when you start talking about ether forces, you have to start talking about resonance and frequency, not mechanical push-pull kind of interactions. And so we have one molecule here, another here. Through their ether effects, they're actually influenced through resonance. Very different than a mechanical model that goes back and forth. So in a way, the ether model is the antithesis of a mechanical model. It says you have to look at the synthesis of everything, look at these planes at infinity and how matter interacts through those planes. And so it's very different than, you know, thinking about chemistry as this reaction causes this reaction, causes this reaction. It says that, there's actually a etheric field that unites all those reactions into one process. So that's where last time I went deeply into talking about processes versus substances. Talking about, for example, the hydrogen process versus the hydrogen as a substance, the sulfur process versus this. And I want to come back to that because I think that's important. So etheric thinking would require that we talk about processes working through time, not spatial substances working through these push-pull kind of interactions. Very different. But it's hard to grasp, but it requires you kind of retool how you think about things. But I think people in, for example, studying Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or Reiki or things like that, I think they're able to tap in. They have an experience of these forces. The chi force, we'd say, is the light ether, and we'd have these experiences moving these different forces, or understanding how they work. So that's one kind of really important difference, I think. When we start to think about etheric spaces, we have to think differently. And that's what Steiner called using the imaginative cognition. To jump into an ether space, you have to jump into a different frame of consciousness. You can't use regular 3D thinking and physical consciousness to understand the ether forces, which is where I think modern science, which is very much based on 3D thinking, it's really, biology and medicine is based on the same thinking we used in physics in the 19th century. The same kind of mechanical forces, no different. But traditional medicines have really gone into more what we might call today quantum thinking, talking about these more resonance-like interactions. And then you start to get interesting effects that if you take two particles, like in electrons in the quantum state, if you entangle them, in other words, electrons have a property, for example, of spin. An electron orbital one is usually spin up, the other one's spin down. You entangle these, and then you separate them, no matter what distance, and change the spin on one particle, the spin on the other particle changes instantaneously. No, faster than any signal could get between them. So in other words, it's some deeper fabric of the world interconnected. And that's an example of the entanglement. So that's kind of how we can start to envision etheric systems as well. They're entangled in this way. So matter, for example, in your liver cells, all of your liver cells, we can say they're entangled so that an influence on one will change all the others at the same time. And this has now been observed that, for example, in tissues, we have all these cells and they're all working with their own biochemistry. The rates of reactions in one cell have to be synchronized with the other cell. They have to be coherent. And that's what health is. So this is where a healthy liver is making and breaking down glycogen at the same rate in every cell at the same time. When one cell starts to go rogue and do its own thing, it's as if falling out of synchronization with the others, and we start to feel sick. And we go to the doctor and we're like, everything looks good. All your blood tests look good, everything. I still feel sick. Well, go home, get some rest, you'll be better. And, that's where we can think that's where the etheric field is starting to break down a little bit, is where those influences are not synchronized appropriately. So that's an example of entrainment through a whole tissue system, for example. And that would be an example of the tone ether in this case, entraining all these cells to kind of work together as a unit, work together as a whole. So quantum coherence, entanglement, those are some examples. And, so I think there's a lot of analogies between quantum mechanics at the subatomic level and the old notions of the etheric forces working through this unique etheric space. An interest of mine has been, so right now there's a lot of interesting, you can say, problems in physics. So for example, how do we combine special relativity and general relativity, which talks about 3D spaces and how they get distorted with gravity, and quantum mechanics? Like there's no way to really join them together. And interestingly, if you start thinking about higher dimensional spaces, you can join them. And so that's where some of the string theory comes in. But there's other approaches that really look at the whole geometry of complex number spaces. So the square root of -1i is one complex number, but there's actually a whole system of complex numbers called quaternions, which the mathematician Sir Arthur Hamilton worked out in the 1900s. Quaternions really have three complex numbers, I, J, and K, and they have very special rules. When you multiply them, they behave very differently than numbers in physical, regular numbers. And this has been kind of an extraction for mathematicians and whatnot, but it's actually, these ideas are applied now in physics. In fact, the original formulation of electromagnetic theory by Clerk Maxwell was based on quaternions. And then that was thrown out by Oliver Heaviside about 10 years later. And he said, it's too complicated to work with quaternions. There's too many variables and whatnot. And he reduced it to the form we have today, which is working with vector calculus and three-dimensional spaces. So in a way, Maxwell's equations originally said, maybe this electromagnetic field is coming from a different space and being projected into physical space. And then Heaviside and others were like, no, they actually called it evil. They said, that's evil. They really use those terms, and they threw it out of mathematics. And then we have our modern form that if you go to engineering school or learn physics, you learn the modern kind of form. So it's interesting how we have all of this in mathematics and physics, but understanding what it means is not there yet. And really, we're going to see as we go forward in these discussions, I'll start to talk about how the next space over from the etheric space. So we can think of the etheric space as being a polar opposite of physical space. There's a third space which is tangent to these. It doesn't exist in space or time. If you think of the physical space as a space, the etheric is more a time element. There's a third element which is orthogonal or 90 degrees to those spaces that exists only in the complex numbers. And that would be what historically people have called the astral or psychic space. So when you go into the dream world, you're actually in a space. And it's just that the dimensions of that space can't be described with physical integers. You have to use complex numbers. When you start to think about that, you're like, wow, we actually have all the math of the astral world. It's just that we don't understand what it means, and how what we're looking at actually is that if you want to unify the forces of physics, you have to go up into higher worlds. And you have to describe it from that perspective. And then it really makes things fascinating when you start to think about that. So this goes back to that original idea that what we see in the physical world, physical space and matter is a projection from higher spaces into this world. The time element is the first element that moves these projections into the physical, and then we can back up further into the complex number spaces and go into the astral world and higher worlds and start to see that. And that's where people have, I think, historically been attuned to those worlds. And a lot of the language we have in Chinese medicine and whatnot is actually describing experiences in those worlds, not so much the experience in 3D physical space. 3D physical space thinking really didn't start in the West until after the Renaissance. In fact, we can say the third dimension perspective was kind of born in the Renaissance. Before that, if you look at art, for example, from 400 AD, it was all flat. Everything is flat. It's like two-dimensional. And that's the experience you have when you go into the astral world. You actually lose a dimension in your normal reality. And so everything looks flat, like the beings look flat and whatnot. So in a sense, we were born in our consciousness in the third dimension after the Renaissance. And we've taken that further. But traditional medicines still have this inkling, although they can't describe it with the same clarity as we can describe, for example, a vector space. Traditional medicines still have an inkling of these older conceptual types of consciousness that could peer into these other spaces. So understanding the etheric, I think, is the first step we need to take to get us out of physical space and physical thinking. And that's where I've spent a lot of time kind of discussing the forces and activities that one sees from this. So that's our first step here, moving into these spaces, is to think about the etheric, which brings us life, brings us our life activities. So hopefully that gives a little bit more of a context of how these ideas, I know it can be very difficult, and it'd be a whole discussion. In fact, we could write papers on how physical and Euclidean and polar Euclidean spaces come together. But there have been actually a few books written on this. There was a woman, a mathematician, Olive Wicker, who wrote several books, but one really beautiful one was called Sun Spaces. In fact, Rudolf Steiner described the sun actually as an interaction of etheric space with physical. And so what we think is a solid ball of gas, he actually argued if you could fly a satellite through the corona into the core, you'd find it's actually a negative space. We call it a black hole today. And that what it's actually doing is attracting energy from the cosmos and then radiating it back out. So it's not a generator like, hydrogen fusing. And, this, of course, is very different than the modern astrophysical model, which is to say it's a big ball of hydrogen gas, which is fusing. But there's some interesting phenomena about the sun, for example, that the corona or the outer layers of the sun are much hotter than the interior, which doesn't make sense with the usual pressure cooker model where you have hydrogen fusing and then it should be hotter in there and then it gets cooler as it goes out. But it's actually the opposite. There's also a field known as Helioseismology, believe it or not, where they study the ripples on the surface of the sun. And this kind of indicates the forces flowing through the sun, And some of the models suggest that actually for the models to work, the sun would have to be hollow. That's the only way the model would work out correctly. So there's some interesting indicators from physics that maybe the sun isn't what we think it is, or stars actually, from this perspective, are actually etheric spaces moving into physical space. What Steiner and others argued is that the bud in every plant buds, are actually, if you cut a bud open, slice it open, look at it in cross section, the growth tip right above it is hollow. So it's like a hollow space attracting energy in and then radiating that energy out through the different cells and beings. So the way to look at a bud is not that it's something pushing out, but it's something like an antenna attracting energy in, and then that goes into the plant. So it's a very different way of thinking, very different than our usual modes, which are based on kind of outward pushing effects. So a plant pushes itself out of the ground, so forth. This view would say the plant is sucked out of the ground, and so forth. So there's opposite forces. Again, in the etheric, everything is opposite. So to gravity, there's an opposite force, a levity force, which actually pulls living organisms up. And the people who talk about this often give the interesting example that, Newton came up with the idea of gravity looking at an apple falling from a tree, and he thought, oh, that's how the moon is falling around the earth, and there must be some force connecting them. He didn't stop to think, how did the apple get up there in the first place? What is the force that made the apple rise up against gravity? That's really interesting to think about. This would be, from this way of thinking, this would be the etheric forces that are effectively leading the matter against gravity. We call it, of course, the effect of the light, phototropic effects, and so forth. But that's a description. That's not really an explanation for why that's happening. So anti-gravity forces, levity forces. And then I mentioned last time that, when we look at electricity and magnetism, we can see those as being fallen ethers that have fallen into physical space. So, or projected into physical space. So for example, what we see as electrical phenomena, Steiner argued, is really the projection of light ether into physical space. What we see as magnetic phenomena is projection of the tone ether into physical space. So using electricity, you could potentially then influence the light ether and so forth. And he argued that the electrification of the planet was actually not a good thing because we were trapping more light ether, which is really on a higher sense related to consciousness, and we'll get into that. But it's as if trapping consciousness into physical matter, making us more physical, less able to contact those higher worlds, less able to actually connect with them. So again, very foreign ways of thinking to how we approach things today. So that's the gist of kind of a very general introduction to ether forces, ether spaces, and then the forces that work through. And again, they're historically been described as being 4 primary forces. And Steiner gave them the name of, as I talked about. In Chinese medicine, as I talked about, they've been associated with the warmth ether with yang forces, and the life ether with more yin forces, and then the light ether with qi, that's what we call qi, and then the tone ether with blood, the blood activity. So the yang, qi, blood, yin, the four primary physiological activities that are discussed in Chinese medicine relate to the ethers. And in our modern biomedical sense, we can relate them to conventional physiology, looking at the warmth ether really is connected with metabolism, mitochondrial activity, and the generation of warmth, ATP, and so forth. That's very much related to arterial blood flow, let's say, into an organ. So the warmth ether of the liver would be generated or connected with that arterial blood supply and the oxygen and everything in there. And then the qi effects would come about more through the influence of the nerve activity in an organ. So organs like the liver, intestines, etc., have their own nervous system related to the autonomic nervous system. And that's where these light ether effects would flow through. So increasing the light ether would activate the nervous system, and that usually has the effect of activating the organ activity. Sometimes it goes too far, and that can suppress the organ activity, too much nerve activity in that organ. And that's what we call qi constriction or qi constraint in the Chinese medicine language. Qi deficiency would be a lack of that autonomic activity. And then the blood aspect would come in through the nutrition from the blood itself, but also interstitial fluids, hormones that are dissolved in that, and everything else. So that blood aspect is very nourishing. It has a ability really to, if we ask what is in the physical chemical sense, what is the giver of life activities, it's electrons. And when we talk about antioxidants, these are very electron-rich substances that give electrons to quench free radicals, which really are when we devitalize something, take the electrons away, we create free radicals. And so in a sense, anything that's devitalizing, like I said in a couple episodes ago, we talked about how the nerve thinking forces are very devitalizing. Consciousness is very devitalizing. And that really depletes us of electrons. So then we have to nourish the blood, as they say in Chinese medicine, to replenish that electron supply to give more life activities. And then finally, the yin effects would be in an organ, would be the actual structure, the connective tissue, what we call the stroma, the form of the organ three-dimensionally. And so each organ can be seen as having a combination of these four activities. And we study them. If you just go to conventional medical school, you study the arterial supply, the nerve supply, the lymph and the venous supply, and then, or drainage, and then the structure of the organ. That's how we study the organs. And so they're reflected down on that physical level. But we have to think of them again as the warmth activities are more, they're not a thing, they're an activity. Same with the light ether, it's an activity. Where I think this can be very helpful is we can start looking, for example, at plants. The way we look at plants now and like plant chemistry and medicinal plants in conventional medicine is to think of them as drugs, where they have specific chemical constituents we can give the body. And we can certainly trace out the constituents. Again, thinking about constituents is using that billiard ball analogy. We ingest this constituent, hits a receptor, does this, etc. And so from that way of thinking, you want to get more constituents in, you want to get more into the blood. From the etheric way of thinking, we'd say that plants riding on the backs of those constituents are these four forces. So certain plants like the mint, when we ingest a mint, maybe you just put a drop of tincture of rosemary on your tongue, for example, it really stimulates within your organism the warmth ether activity. And with rosemary, it does that very clearly, or very strongly, we can say, in the cardiovascular system, like the heart itself. And that's why historically rosemary has always been associated with the heart and increasing the warmth of the heart, working with that. Versus other herbs like dandelion, there we have a very strong influence with the bright yellow flowers and whatnot, very strong influence of the light as well as the tone ethers with the leaves. And so in a sense, with dandelion, you're stimulating the lights and those nourishing antioxidant forces in specific areas of the body. In the case of dandelion, it's in the liver system. So there'll be, as we'll see with plants, there's an additional level of information you need. Which organ does it go to? But we can say it stimulates certain activities within that organ. So it stimulates the autonomic and increases bile flow. It increases the autonomic activity. So the liver will detox better. It will remove substances better and so forth. So that would be one way of thinking about how we can go beyond just a phytochemical model and use an etheric model of understanding how a plant influences the organism. And I think, although it's not as exact always as the biochemical model, it gives us an additional insight, which I think is a lot easier to work with in the clinic. If you look at medicinal plants now and look at, what does dandelion do? Antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, antihypertensive, diuretic, it's these anti there. And you end up, and then you say, okay, well, that's great. Well, what does another herb like milk thistle do? Antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, same thing. So you end up with this kind of way of thinking, which is very piecemeal. And so you end up with like this feeling like, well, I don't know what any herb does, because they all do the same thing. They're all anti this and that. But when you start to look at how dandelion has very strong light ether versus milk thistle has a lot of that yin element, the tone, and then the life ether, they give very different effects. So the way I've usually visualized the etheric forces in the clinic is to think about colors. And I know, color is part of the light phenomena, but we can kind of generalize it to all the ethers and say that the light ether itself is very strong in the yellow spectrum. And that's when you see, I mentioned dandelion, when you see plants with yellow blossoms, often that indicates there's a very strong light ether element in there. We say that chi element is very strong, that light chi is very strong in there. Versus plants like milk thistle, has more purple flowers, that has more of the life ether effect. And then others have more bluish flowers, and that's more the chemical tone or blood nourishing effect. And then others have more reddish in their signatures, like cinnamon and so forth, and that has more the warmth element in it. So it gives you artistically, almost like a color palette, a way of saying, fennel is actually kind of a combination of more the yellow and the red, so that it's more of an orange effect, versus milk thistle is more blue purple. They're kind of opposites on the spectrum. So that makes you think, should I mix them together? Well, maybe not. Maybe that would dilute their effects if I mix them together and so forth. So it almost gives you another way of analyzing herbs and herbal formulas, is to think in terms of the ethers and these life activities and how they're influencing. So I found it gives a model for me to then understand their chemistry from a deeper angle than just memorizing a bunch of lists. I don't think in Chinese medicine there isn't much of an influence of that. There is, for example, in naturopathic medicine, an herb is described more from the chemical perspective, and then maybe the traditional indications are thrown in. In Chinese medicine, I think there still is an appreciation for the warmth, the qi, the blood nourishing, and the yin activities, and so we describe herbs from that perspective still. So I think that's still part of the language. So that's how we could, maybe one little insight into how we can use the ether forces to understand something a little bit deeper. Last time I discussed how the human body, if we turn it into ash, in the physical sense, really has 4 primary elements: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. And then some sulfur and phosphorus, and then your electrolytes and trace metals and whatnot. And so those are the 4 building blocks of life. What's interesting when you study these elements from what we might call the phenomenological angle, in other words, look at how they manifest in nature and the inorganic and the organic world. What are the qualities of the element versus the quantities? Chemistry is very much, since the late 1700s, and we can think chemists like Lavoisier and whatnot for this, was very much based in quantities. But the old alchemists used to think in terms of qualities, which capture those etheric activities, I think, a lot better. So if you look at carbon, if you look in the inorganic world, carbon is really, we find that in graphite, coal, diamond, that's carbon as well. So it's interesting to think that coal and graphite are made of the same elements, but they're structured, the carbon is structured differently. So those are, diamond, the hardest substance in nature. And then if you look at organic chemistry, really you can say organic chemistry is just the chemistry of carbon. Like all those millions of organic molecules have carbon backbones, and then we add functional groups and whatnot to those. So really the backbone of life, the form, the structure of life is based on carbon. That is the physical image. We can say carbon carries the tone ether activity. So that's structuring yin activity, that's carbon. In fact, people have talked about the philosopher's stone. What is the philosopher's stone? You can add it to anything, it turns anything into gold. That was one interpretation. But the older interpretation was that the philosopher's stone was actually the knowledge of how to work with carbon, which is basically organic chemistry. They're the philosopher's stone these days. Knowing how to work with carbon, you can make any living structure on the planet. And so that is carbon chemistry. When you look at oxygen, the next building block of life, where you find that in nature in the greatest quantity, a lot of people think oxygen in the air. It's actually not. The air is only about 20% oxygen, the atmosphere. Where you find oxygen in the highest amount is in water. So H2O by molecular weight is mostly oxygen because the hydrogen is very light. And so we can say oxygen is all about water and water chemistry and all that kind of thing. Oxygen is very rich in electrons in its outer valence shell, so it can donate electrons. And so it can take and give electrons. So it's very much involved in these oxidation and reduction reactions. And so it is the basis of you can say that watery life activity. So we can say the oxygen is what carries the tone ether forces into living organisms. And so that's one manifestation of those tone ether activities. Then when we look at
clarification, so then the oxygen goes with the tone ether, and then the carbon actually goes with the life ether.
Life ether. Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah, so we'd say the life ether would be more the yin in Chinese medicine, tone ether more the blood element. Yeah. And then when we look at nitrogen, in the inorganic world, we find nitrogen is, we find it in things like ammonia, ammonium salts and whatnot. And many of these compounds are highly unstable, and they are the basis of explosives. So all of our major explosives are based on nitrogen, trinitrotoluene, TNT, all these kind of things use nitrogen chemistry as their main area. And of course, where we see it in abundance in nature is in the atmosphere. The atmosphere, the wind, the air element is mostly nitrogen. People don't think about that when they're breathing air, you're breathing in nitrogen. Now, of course, the nitrogen is in the molecular form, which is N2, and living organisms normally can't react with that. And but certain fungi and plants can actually take that and break it apart, and then the nitrogen is freed up for the plant to use. That was probably the biggest advent in chemistry. The biggest development was in around 1910, when the chemist Fritz Haber figured out how to take atmospheric nitrogen and break it apart to make fertilizer. And that, we can say, created the size of the population we have today. Is that one chemical reaction. Without that, we would have a fraction of the number of people living on the planet. Because of that. So if we didn't have that, so that's the nitrogen is the air element, explosions. If we look at organic substances, nitrogen is really at the basis of proteins, protein chemistry. And with proteins now we have enzymes, we have structural proteins, muscles, movement. And so nitrogen, we can say, takes the watery element and moves it into the airy, the life activity. And so that's really the carrier of the light ether, is the nitrogen element. So nitrogen activity is our carrier there. It's interesting with carbon, with oxygen, carbohydrates really is just H2O with carbon. So carbohydrates are really just hydrated carbon. So it has the carbon and the oxygen element, but there's no nitrogen in there. So carbon is very much more related to, or carbohydrates are more related to the watery activity, versus now proteins move into the airy activity with the nitrogen. There's a very interesting example of this. If you look at the biomolecule, that's most abundant in the biosphere, that's cellulose, which is basically a modified carbohydrate. It's a carbohydrate, cellulose. That makes up most of, the structure of trees, everything, that's cellulose. Long chain with carbohydrates. When you take nitrogen, so insects, for example, in insect wings, they take cellulose and they put nitrogen on it to make a substance called chitin. And chitin makes the wings and the outer carapaces of the invertebrates. So we can say it moves the carbohydrate into the animal realm, and the animal activities, which have been historically related to the air and the light activities. So in a sense, nitrogen is moving us from life into the airy and the light-filled element. And so it has a very strong connection with that light ether element. So that's the nitrogen activity. So that's, I think, a beautiful image of how cellulose, give it nitrogen, it becomes wings. It flies now, and it's active in that. So that's nitrogen, the nitrogen process. There's another element that works alongside of nitrogen often, and it's in the same group in the periodic table, and that's phosphorus. So nitrogen and phosphorus really bring that light activity. In fact, phosphor, when it was first discovered in the 1600s by a German chemist, he actually, in his backyard, apparently distilled heaps and heaps of urine and feces to get just a little bit of phosphorus out of it. And he thought that was the basis of life. He had in this flask phosphorus, and it glows. You can imagine the 1600s with no electrical light, and he has this flask of glowing stuff. It's like, I found life. I found the basis of life. And, it's a light bearer. Phosphor is the light bearer. And we, of course, know phosphorus in the body is involved in ATP, of course, but also all of your intermolecular signaling. A lot of it depends on phosphorylation reactions, where phosphorus is added to different reactions, almost like a switch to activate them. So phosphorus is very important, obviously, in chemistry. Also, your nerves, also related to the animal self, is very richly wrapped in phospholipids. So phospholipids form the membranes of all your cells, but very rich phosphorus compounds are in your nerve sheets and whatnot. And then finally, if you look at the fourth building block of life chemically, that's hydrogen. And if you look at where hydrogen really is in abundance, it's in, like, for example, methane, CH4. That's carbon with 4 hydrogens. Incredible amounts of heat and warmth. So we can say that is an image of the warmth process in nature. And of course, we think today, again, going back to our modern view of the sun, it's that it's a big ball of hydrogen that's burning, that's fusing into helium, And so hydrogen is a representation of the warmth activity. It carries warmth ether into the body. So wherever you see a lot of hydrogen process, you have warmth. So in nature, in the organic world, where we see a lot of hydrogen is in fats, lipids, oils. So we can say the oils, the fats are stored warmth. They're chains of carbon that are just saturated with hydrogen. And so we have stored warmth activity. And so when you build up fat in the body, you're really storing up warmth that's become physicalized, that's not being released, not being burned, or not being transformed again into actual warmth. So, fats store warmth. If you look at, for example, plants, we have what are called the volatile oils, like in the mint family and whatnot. So these little volatile oils, they're usually what are called monoterpenes or sesquiterpenes. And these are molecules that have a very small carbon chain, usually 10 carbons long, and they're just saturated with hydrogen. So like little fats, and they're light enough that they volatilize. But that's what gives us the scent of the flowers and whatnot. So that's a warmth activity. So really beautiful to see how the ethers themselves play out through these elements right into the biochemistry. A related element to hydrogen would be sulfur. And so sulfur activities, you can say, is another carrier of warmth. And where we see that in nature, phenomenologically, is in volcanoes, like the sulfur smell, all that. That's heat, warmth. If you burn sulfur, it doesn't burn with a very bright flame like phosphorus does, or these others. It actually, it has not a lot of light, but has a lot of warmth. So that's where light and warmth are actually separate kind of activities. in the ether sense. I spent 3 months in the Antarctic in college as a researcher, and there was intense light activity. You know, the sun when we were there never went down. It was the Antarctic summer, and the light, there's nothing, it's just reflecting off the snow, but it's cold. You know, so the warmth element is not quite there, but the light element is very strong. So the hydrogen and sulfur combine more of the warmth element, and the nitrogen and phosphorus more the you know, the light element, and then oxygen, but then related things like magnesium and potassium, more the watery life elements, that tone ether element. And then finally carbon, but also silicon, which is in the body, we use silica, which is silica with oxygen, in very small amounts, like in the hair, the skin, in your sensory organs, very strongly related to the nervous sensory system. And then another structural mineral would be calcium. So calcium salts in your bone, for example. So you can say that form element works through different elements like carbon, silica, calcium, but it's all the same form element that's kind of working there. So it gives us a different way of maybe putting more life back into chemistry. You know, we tend to memorize the elements just with their valence shell electrons, a number of protons, and that's useful for chemical reaction calculation, but you lose the qualities of the elements. And that's, I think, very important to kind of sit with these elements and work with them and see what are the forces, what are the activities that they're carrying. And now you're starting to think more etherically. You're starting to think more about the ether effects. So when I give someone oils, fats, I'm really stimulating an inner warmth process. When I'm giving them silica, I'm really stimulating the forming tone, life ether processes, sorry. And then when I give potassium, I'm really activating those tone ether forces within the organism. So etheric chemistry would be sort of a parallel to conventional chemistry that looks at these forces. If we look at plants, you know, the plants are, they create these different metabolites, you know, we would call primary metabolites, which is carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So all plants make carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, different proportions. Some plants are very rich in oils and whatnot. But then individual plant species or genera make or families have enzymes to make what are called secondary plant metabolites. And the three primary classes of secondary plant metabolites are the phenolic compounds, which if you look at them, they're basically carbon and oxygen with some hydrogen. So phenol is the simple building block, but you build phenol up in the more complex shapes and you get things like the flavonoids. So all the flavonoids in the different classes, anthocyanins, which give the bluish color, purplish colors often. These are, we can say, related to that tone ether process. Many of those compounds are very antioxidant. They actually work with that fluidic process. And in plants, they're actually stored within the center of plant cells. There's a big hollow space filled with water called the vacuole, and that's where the flavonoids are stored, is in there. So a very strong watery element with that, kind of like the carbohydrates. And then the next major class of secondary plant metabolites are the alkaloids. And the alkaloids really, what makes them unique is they contain nitrogen, that air element. In fact, if you look at alkaloid-bearing plants, like for example, belladonna, deadly nightshade, very rich in the belladonna alkaloids, the atropine and whatnot. You know, this plant looks almost like an animal. It has the flowers look like an organ almost forming in a way. So it's like the light ether forces, very strong in the atmosphere, moving very deeply into the plant, so deep that it stimulates the generation of alkaloids. That's how we would think about it in the phenomenological language. And when you take this as a medicine in very, very small amounts, you know, the effect of atropine is to block your parasympathetic nervous system. It wakens up your animal sympathetic nervous system. So your eye, your pupils dilate, or they open up, and you look startled. It's almost like it's trying to become awake within you. So alkaloid-bearing plants have the potential for being very toxic. And that's why when you use them a lot in like traditional medicines, But interestingly, modern pharmacology is based on, it started with the study of alkaloids in plants. So alkaloids like opium, caffeine, digitalis, all of these are, very sort of founded or created, modern pharmacology. Digitalis is an exception. It's not not an alkaloid. But alkaloids have that nitrogen element, that air, that light ether. And when you take them, they awaken the light ether within your nervous system in a very particular way. And then the third major class of secondary metabolites in plants are the terpenes and terpenoids. And the small ones are like the monoterpenes. They create the volatile oils. But then you build up terpenes like Lego blocks. You put them bigger together into chains, and you start to get the sesquiterpenes, the diterpenes, and then you get things like the steroids. So plant steroids and so forth, and then carotenoids like keratin, beta carotene and whatnot. And then you really build it up, you get rubber as a polymer of the little isoprene units. But terpenes are built on this little, what's called isoprene. It's a little 5-carbon chain with the hydrogen. You just stack them together and you create monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, diterpenes, and so forth. Those are all related to warmth. And say those are, all those chemically have some connection with warmth in the body. In fact, I'll just take one somewhat esoteric example from Chinese medicine. There is a classic mint which is used for cardiovascular disease, and it's been studied in China in great depth. And this is Chinese salvia, red sage, Salvia miltiorhiza. And we use the
call
root.
it a danshen.
Danshen, right. Use the root. It actually looks reddish. So that kind of indicates a warmth signature right there. But the primary constituents in there are what are known as diterpenes. So it's a type of terpene. And these have very strong effects on the cardiovascular system. They actually act as what we call calcium channel blockers. They improve circulation in the peripheral capillary beds. They are antihypertensive and so forth. So there's a connection with that warmth property there. Ginkgo, interestingly, not in the same family. It's not a mint, but it has diterpenes, and we think ginkgo actually has effects. This has been studied with some positive outcomes, some negative, on improving, for example, cerebral circulation, the ginkgo leaf. So this is an example of how we can use that more phenomenological language and then take it down to the chemistry and study that and work with it. So they're not exclusive. It's almost like putting art back into the science. So you can start to think about these almost like colors on a color wheel or a color palette to work with. So that's the 3 primary classes of secondary metabolites. And then the primary metabolites, carbohydrates, proteins, fats. So all of this is related, and it really opens up new avenues in understanding biochemistry.
Great. Well, that's it's a lot of I think for someone new to this, I mean, this would be a lot of information just to kind of sit with. And I'm wondering even would a study method per se to look at these basic groups such as like carbs, proteins, or fats, or even the nitrogen, carbon, oxygen.
There's
and to think backwards, like what is the basic signature of this molecule, and then to even revisit this talk and reintegrate.
Yeah, so you need to have experience at this point. I have to go out and look at these connections. But not just studying the molecule, but also where does it appear in nature? What does it react with? What does it work with? There's a very beautiful book that actually, you can get it, I think, for free online. It might be a PDF at this point. It's written by Rudolf Hauschka. People have probably heard of the Hauschka Beauty Products. He actually founded the company that makes those. He died, I think, back in the 70s or something, but he was originally a student with Rudolf Steiner. And he wrote a couple of really beautiful books, but one that really inspired me years ago is called The Nature of Substance. And he goes through this discussion in a lot more detail. So I would highly recommend that for anyone that wants to kind of expand out and look at this. And then there are many others from that, but I think that's a good starting point, is to work with that.
Well, we can definitely put that link in the comments for our viewers. Yeah, just a very quick review. Carbs, fats, and proteins go with which ethers? I
So the
guess.
carbs would be, we can say fixed water. So that's when you eat carbs, it can tend to increase those life-giving, filling out forces, the tone ether forces. So that's carbohydrates. Proteins are more associated with the nitrogen element and air in the light ether. So proteins, they stimulate all of your inner chemistry. They drive everything. They move everything. So air is really the signature for that is movement. We'd say in Chinese medicine, wind. That's really that. And then finally, the warmth element would be the fats and the oils and so forth. And then in the secondary metabolites in the plants, it would be the carbohydrates and phenols and polyphenols, same group, that's all tone ether. And then the alkaloids would be connected with the proteins and the nitrogen process. And then the terpenes and terpenoids would be part of the warmth processes. So when you go into plant biochemistry, if you get into medicinal chemistry, you'll see those same three classes. There's a couple of little secondary classes, but they're really subclasses. So for example, cyanogenic compounds are part of the nitrogen activity, like you have in peach pit and things like that, the cyanide process. And then you have the sulforaphanes, which is sulfur. That's the warmth process. That's another image of that. So pretty much with that, you would have all plant chemistry, and then the rest is just the details, where it's very interesting and that requires a lot of study. But it's good to have the overarching organization first, and then you can go down into the parts because that helps you understand it better.
Yeah, it's not I mean, one could say it's a shortcut, but it'll just make sense of all the details in a way that's practical and actionable.
I mean, it's pointing out what I have been trying to do here is like, what are the organizing wholes in nature? And these four are four very important wholes you have to look at. I'll just say one little side comment. In episode 3, we talked about the three organizing forces, the salting, the mercury, the sulfur. They're related. We can say the tonal ether and the life ether are related to the salting element. The light ether and warmth are related to the sulfur element, sulfur process. And then the connection between the light ether and the tone ether is the mercury process. So, they're connected, we can say. So I'm using two different lenses here. One started with 3, and now we're breaking into 4. And we're going to next break into 7, and then 12. And then we'll have a model. But these are, again, on a very fundamental level, describing processes that are projected into physical space from other spaces. And that's where I think it is difficult, because we're so not used to thinking about that in medicine. Although, again, in math and physics, we do it all the time. We just we don't know that they're representing real worlds, and that we can actually, in our feeling life, in our imaginary life, and imaginative life, and our intuitive life, are entering those worlds, and we're working there. We just don't know how they're related to the mathematics that we see on the paper. But I think very intuitive mathematicians kind of have that inkling, and that was a question in math, are all these spaces real or not? And I would argue, yeah, they are.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's just say I have a friend who was a math major and then he became a Buddhist monk, after that. So maybe he'll come out on the other side.
Well, I think that is important. Why? Okay, that's nice and abstract. But, if we are to link the traditional medicine concept with modern thinking, I feel like it's important to be able to, okay, well, if you talk about etheric spaces, give me the math, write a textbook. I mean, really, that would have, if we're going to get to that level, we need to be able to do that. And I think that's going to happen. We're going to be able to see how we can expand chemistry by bringing in a notion of etheric space. to really give us insight into biochemistry that we currently don't have, thinking just three-dimensionally, in three-dimensional space. And to think about psychic phenomena, emotional phenomena, we have to start to think about an astral space and how that influences the etheric and then the physical. And then to think about our thoughts, to get into a thought space requires you go another space over. And so in a way, we are living in a sort of matrix in our physical consciousness that's being projected by these higher spaces. But we are in our inner life going to those spaces all the time. We just don't think of that as a real thing. When you go into your thoughts or your feelings, you think that's just in your brain. That's not true. From this perspective, you are entering different spaces that have real forces, that have their own laws, that behave not just willy-nilly, but they have an actual lawfulness. It's just that the laws, like in the astral world, are very different than the laws in the physical. Gravity is different. If you just think of being somewhere in the astral, you're there. You don't have to travel through physical space, you know. So, but once you start to see the laws, you're like, oh, well, that makes sense, you know, and then you can begin to apply them in your life. So hopefully it won't all just be abstraction.
Yeah. So you end up having more freedom because you're not just subject to these laws and reacting to them, but you actually see, oh, this is
right,
you know, pretty close to how it works.
Right. And that really is, you know, I think the brilliance of modern science as we gained an understanding of physical forces and physical space with a degree of clarity that we never had. And so there is an incredible advance in consciousness because of that. I would argue now we need to expand that same way of thinking to the next space over, etheric, and then up the ladder. So maybe in a few hundred years we'll be there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that does take us back to the question of, and maybe this is a paradox, but if we do understand all of those things, then what, you know, are we able, like, is there going to be a place where there is a complete artificial intelligence that is operating based on these principles? Or is there a constant evolution happening?
Right.
Will be it, but I don't know. I mean,
no, that's a great question. I think that opens up a whole other discussion, which we probably won't get into today. But I think having an understanding of the principles, like you said, makes you more free. You're not just enslaved by them or unconscious of them and then influenced by them. You have an understanding of them. So now that we understand the laws of electromagnetism, we can work with that. If you understand the laws of the etheric, you can start to work with etheric technology, which is kind of a big dream, because that would be technology that's not based on entropy or explosion technology, which is what we have today. Car engine, just blowing up gas, you capture that, about 30% of it is captured as work energy, and the rest is heat and waste. You can have etheric engines, which would attract from these ether spaces energy, and that would drive matter. Now, it's difficult to do that because matter in the physical state is not open to those receiving those etheric forces. You have to open matter up, and that gets into maybe a further discussion we can have on remedy preparation. To make a remedy, you have to take the matter or whatever you're working with, the plant or the mineral, you have to open it up to receive the etheric space, etheric information. And that's what the alchemists are doing by boiling things in a flask, having it go to the top and then fall back down again, back and forth, distillation, mixing it, recirculation. And then when it rose up, the matter was now open to receive the etheric influences, and then it recrystallized at the bottom. So the remedy you get is totally different than the raw material you brought in. So that's where you can make the argument that nature is full of potential remedies, but it requires an alchemical preparation to help them once they've been formed in nature by the plant or whatever. You can say that matter is now trapped in physical space under the influence of physical forces. You have to open that matter back up to receive the etheric space and to reconnect it with that space. And that would shine light on why the alchemists were doing all these weird procedures to make medicines. And that's why the modern regulators that go to, these companies are still making the remedies in that way. The FDA goes and they have no idea what they're doing. They're like, this is a bunch of nonsense. You can't do it. And from the material 3D-dimensional thinking, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. But if you start thinking about etheric spaces, like, oh, it makes total sense, you know. But again, science doesn't have that in the textbook. You don't go to medical school or biochemistry class or whatever and learn about etheric forces or spaces. So you don't even know they are there. And that's, I think, in naturopathy, a huge problem. They use the conventional textbooks. Even though there's this vague notion of etheric, vis medicatrix naturae, vital forces, what, they don't know what that is. And so there's this schism. It's like a schizophrenia that happens where you get into these two different mindsets and you don't know how to relate them. You don't know how to connect them. And I think that is the biggest obstacle for progress in so-called holistic medicines right now, is I don't think we'll ever get further until we form that bridge. We write that textbook of etheric chemistry, etheric physiology, and so forth. Then we can start moving to the next level, get eventually to the psychic space. But I think starting with the life forces would be a place to start.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I know we should wrap up, but I know that's, you know, that's really important, because I think a lot of people have ideas about these maybe psychic spaces, informed by a lot of pop culture, but you know, there's not, you know, people are kind of on their own to figure it out and piece things together. There's not, you know, a lot of coherence or consistency. And I think that people who get a broader perspective are the ones who are looking at multiple perspectives and taking the time to find what's in between. But if that could become more of a part of the educational process in a...
Yeah, someday you'll go to college and have a course in etheric vector spaces, and that'll just be like, well, what did you take? What did you do today? I went to etheric vector space 101, you know, so it's possible that we'll get there. You know, I think we will, but it's going to take a lot of inner development. But I do think that if so-called natural integrative holistic medicines are going to flourish, or medicine in general, like, again, if you don't look at the etheric spaces, you can't understand life. You're just dealing with death phenomena. And that's what happens. Our greatest advances in modern medicine are really all about replacing the biologic organism with parts, you know, new prostheses, new implant, you know, all these kind of things. It's almost like we just gave up and said, we don't understand how to regenerate life anymore, but we'll replace it with a machine. And then you got to wonder, where's the end of that? That's kind of like getting into Terminator material here. It creates a kind of a scary picture, you know, versus could we develop, you know, and there's some fringe work in stem cells and whatnot going on, but, you know, could we develop ways of understanding how to influence those etheric forces in tissues so that they regenerate? You know, that's true regenerative medicine right there.
Yeah, well, and without getting banned by the FDA for some... But I don't want, probably shouldn't get into that here, but
sure.
I know like this is my last question. Like, what are some examples of etheric technologies? I know, I mean, we've talked about electrical biorhythms, not on this channel before, but in our conversations, I know I immediately thought of Wilhelm Reich's work with these orgone energy generators.
Reich, yeah, with the orgone. You know, another person I mentioned, I think last time, in the last discussion, that one way of seeing how etheric space interpenetrates with the physical space is to look at vortices, fluid vortices. And so there was an interesting kind of eccentric inventor, scientist, Victor Schauberger, who some people may have heard of. He developed ostensibly what he called an implosion engine based on vortex formation. And he argued that it was, you know, essentially we're getting into a very controversial area. It's called over unity physics. Like, you know, according to current physics, you can't have a perpetual motion machine because you're always going to lose energy as heat and whatnot. This is implying that you could extract energy from the ether field, and that you could translate that into usable work and energy. And that you actually would create a system that could be a perpetual motion machine, essentially. But Schauberger developed these engines, which interesting, you know, effects. In fact, the story goes is that he was hired in World War II. Well, I say hired, he was forced to work for the Nazis for the SS designing special craft using his implosion engine. And there are pictures that leaked out that these craft actually look like UFOs, and that he created some of the technology at the basis of that. And some eyewitnesses said that when they turn these engines on, these craft would just go straight up right to the roof of the hangar and hover in the atmosphere, you know, and that so he was tapping into some kind of force there that was anti-gravitational, which would be the etheric forces. So there's a lot of books and things written about that, and you know, it's very hard to tease out what's actually fact and what's fiction. But I think it opens up the possibility, if we really take this seriously and look at the math behind it and the geometry behind it, to maybe start to envision technologies that would not be based on increasing entropy in the world, but actually decreasing entropy, increasing order. So our technology would actually help regenerate the etheric environment of the earth, versus what we're doing with our current technology is depleting the etheric environment. So we're winding it down. In fact, how nature, if we think of the earth as a living organism having an ether body, as well as a soul and a spirit, we can get to that. That's the Gaia concept. That storms like hurricanes, tornadoes, which create vortices, are actually nature's way of recharging the etheric environment. So where a tornado goes through or where a hurricane goes through, it's very interesting to look at. When these hurricanes move through the ocean past an island, and you can take before and after satellite pictures, the hurricanes ostensibly stir up all the nutrients from the ocean floor and whatnot, and you get this incredible proliferation of life in the area of the ocean where that hurricane moved through. So it's like it recharged that part of the ocean as it moved through. So it actually looks at these, the more we degenerate the etheric environment of the earth, the more of these kind of storms we're going to see as Earth Gaia attempts to heal it through these kinds of ideas. So it opens up all sorts of directions to take. But I think for today, that probably should be enough.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about water and negative ions and the effect that has on brain
chemistry.
chemistry.
All related to that, of course. You know,
and
tossing down a stream, the vortices, you're creating negative ions in that process. And that is, you know, charging the water with tone ether. You even hear it. If the water clinkles down, you hear sound. That's part of that sound element that's coming through there. So yeah, there's a lot of applications of this, and I think that is ultimately the solution to our global energy problems. How to do that practically? Well, that's beyond my skill set. I'm working on it.
Yeah, well, maybe just getting some of these concepts out there, and
I got to start with the foundations first, and then build from there, right?
Yeah,
like, you know, Clerk Maxwell worked out the 4 equations of electromagnetics, you know, in the 1860s, and then it was only, you know, 20 years, 30 years later that Hertz took that and made electromagnetic waves in radio. But at that time, you know, there were mathematicians teaching Clerk Maxwell's equations saying this is a nice formalism, but it doesn't mean anything. You know, it wasn't realized it could be applied to technology. And now we have all of our radio technologies, everything based on those 4 electromagnetic equations. Again, Maxwell didn't make the 4, it was people after him. But the idea was the principles that were there were turned into technologies. And so I think understanding the etheric geometries and spaces would be the first step. And then we can start to think about technologies that come from that.
Great. Well, one last question before we wrap up for the day. This is seriously the last one. We talked about blood and the chemical tone ether, and this having to do with electrons and antioxidants as electron carriers. And there is this theory of talking about like ions of when we put our feet on the earth, there's a charge of negative ions that rush up the body and create this antioxidant effect within the body. And, you know, we've also connected this chemical tone ether to blood and Chinese medicine. So I wonder if we could postulate that somehow putting our feet on the earth has a blood nourishing activity.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're actually getting both the tone ether and the life ether as well, but really the tone ether is coming in strongly, coming more from the warmth and the light from your sensory organs, from more the upper pole That's where the light ether and the warmth ether work. So they stream down into you from above, and then these other ethers work up from below. So absolutely, when you put your feet on the earth, that's what's happening. And then you connect with the sun, brings the light and the warmth ether in. So yeah, you get all the systems going.
Great. Well, I think we all need more of that. And certainly I know at the end of this last discussion in episode 4, we also discussed a little bit about how to maintain our own etheric vitality, which, through our even just asking questions about how to, relate to ourselves in a better way, or doing Qigong or any sort of practice that, and until we have more etheric technology, maybe at least we have these.
Well, the technology is secondary, I think, to be able to tune your consciousness to perceive it. So just having the concept, you're still in physical space, but then you start to experience it, the flow of energy from the ground, which comes streaming in from below, which you talked about with Qigong, that expansive feeling back and forth. You're actually tapping into your ether body. You're experiencing the flow of energies. And so that's where that's the subtle energy. But again, these aren't the same as physical energies. And so when people talk about energy medicine, I don't like that term, because this etheric energy is much more informational. It's not just like charging up a battery. It's giving the body the information it needs to grow and to structure itself appropriately. So it's much different than physical energy. So we should really, I think, differentiate those. Yeah.
Right. Well, we have the beginnings of the next giant science textbook for the masses that'll be ready in a couple 100 years. Hopefully before then.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that we should mention today for listeners before we wrap up?
No, I think that's good. I think if people want to look at the Rudolf Hauschka book, again, I think it's either available as a free PDF online if you just Google it, or maybe Kindle or something has copies of it. But I think that's a great introduction to this kind of way of thinking. He's much more articulate than I am at advancing these ideas.
Great. Well, if you like this, if you're still out there listening, if you like this video or you found it helpful or useful, be sure to hit the like button, share with your friends and loved ones or people you feel might enjoy it. Subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you can become a part of our journey. And my name's Motoyuki.
And I'm Dr. Kalnins.
And this was another episode of Enliven Medicine. And look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye.
All right, bye.